Let's start with the questions. Here I was asked one question about such a big pro, in fact, this is very important. Money management is a pretty important point that you must understand without fail. If you do not have an understanding, you have liquidations there that should not actually be, then right, ask. We have a special template for the answer I am with a minus deal, where I will help you. I will help you and understand your situation. Let's go. I read out the question. I have a question about the display of walruses. I was knocked out twice. I went to a small deposit to understand the principle of work on the exchange. And in a word, the second time I was touched on the listing of the DUT coins, which we recently worked out in 1000% closed. I watched the ether of Coley, in which there were about 2,000 on deposit. He went to 200, this is 10% of the deposit. Immediately, a person does not have an understanding that this is not 10% of the deposit. And I understood that the sum of the entry with the 50th shoulder is eventually divided by 50, that is, we divide 200 by 50 and it turns out 4. She had a real minimum deposit of about 30, initially 60, for literally hours before 30. I think he dispersed it to 30, okay. However, I devoured it with one coin, a moment, and left a depot of 10. I closed to go to the listing. I went to 2, which basically meant entering 004, which theoretically meant that I went to 0.4% of the depot. However, I didn't have a moment's glimpse of the mix. I found a futures calculator, kept the data. The entry point was 001. If I'm not mistaken, this is exactly our entry point, which we had. And this output of coal on the air eventually raised the amount on the calculator futures. In fact, coal were approximately similar. That is, it did not differ at times. I have a real question about exposing walruses. I enter by order by value, not by order, by quantity. I'm just a little confused about placing an order. It turns out that the order is already placed taking into account the leverage, that is, if up to 30. Then the order is immediately placed taking into account them in the amount of 0.5%. I perfectly understand a person that he is just confused in, so to speak, understanding the functionality of the exchange. Now we'll figure it out. Here at cost, not at cost, where we will have. We're going to figure it out now. Let's fill in the price. What does this mean? Let me be like a beginner, that is, I went to the stock exchange and will sort out the stock exchange. I'm going to put myself in the role of a beginner so that you have as much as 100% idea of what's going on and how I understand it. I click here to fill in the amount and here in coins, but definitely I don't need it. I choose to fill in at the price of US, click OK. So, let's say there will be a market price. Here I write 100 and see here that I probably have a honeycomb with a key to open on. Now. Yeah, I'm here now, guys. I am now confused myself along the way, because everyone has different exchanges in different ways. That's it, now I understand. On understand, for example, to fill out an order at cost, this is what you write the amount here, multiplied by the shoulder already. That is, here you see that the price is 1 and 1, this will be my walrus. That is, well, even now I won't be too lazy to open the shorts, if he lets me. And this is not minimal. I wonder what the minimum is. Let's put up the 50th shoulder here, so that we often work with the 50th. That's it, here I have, in fact, 4 or 3 walruses. We divide 200 by 50, 4. Walruses actually have to be. And here I don't see where I have a walrus written, and for some reason, I opened it for the cost of 100 when I wrote 200. Interesting. Something is probably wrong with me. 001 Bitcoin, that is, if it costs 102. Then it can open a maximum of 102 or 204, you know. And he writes 2. 1. C2 and 1 down there. Yes, I can see that it is. I realized, I just opened it for 200, and this confused me. He has a minimum there. Yes, I understand. He's circumcised thereby. Now guys. Yes, now it turns out that we have opened a Bybit in Medrin, here at a minimum, usually it's just written walrus. Or the amount from the deposit. Here we have 2 walruses written here. In fact, I came in, I have a deposit of $990 here, to calculate some percentage so that Because some people also have this question. We are 990, that is, we take my deposit, divide by 100, thereby we find out 1%. And if we need 0.5% of the deposit, then we multiply this number, our 1%, by 0.5. And we get that 495 is, for example, 0.5% of the deposit, that is, about $5. Now I'm going to write this amount back, and 9 and 9. I'll figure it out now. 9 and 9 is $1 for us, and we have 2 and 1 now. It's probably somewhere around 0.2. Yes, well, about 0.203% of the deposit I have here in the transaction. If you go back to the coin, they go. Of course, I have a huge misunderstanding of how a person could be liquidated if he went to the listing. There the coin went to the edge, well, 300%. 200, 300% was the maximum that we saw minus on this coin, plus. It seems like it shouldn't be much here, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, it is at the bottom, in fact, near the bottom, so to speak, it is trading. We came here. Well, even here, well, in this area, there is 0.1 with something. The option why a person could be liquidated is an isolated margin. This is the first one. By the way, let's figure it out again right away on WEEX. This is the US order size by volume. That is, here if you write the amount, it is the amount that is already multiplied by the leverage. This can even be understood by the costs. The costs here are written to dollars. $2 is my $2 will be used in this position. These $2 are multiplied by the 50th shoulder, and it turns out that I will have $100 in the position. This amount multiplied by my used, so to speak, funds from the deposit. It's called a walrus just the same. Here we went to 200, it's not 10% of the deposit, it's much less, because this is the amount. Multiplied by the leverage, and we consider it the margin. At that moment, even now I'm going to open the calculator with you. There was probably even a deposit of a little over 2,000, but okay. We take $2,000, divide it by 100, we get that 20 margin, $20 of mine. It will be only 1% of the deposit. And I, let me remind you, had 4 and 2 here. That is, if I multiply by 0.5, and this, that is, by 0.5% of the deposit, if I went to the maximum. Yes, it would only be 10 walruses. We see that I have only entered 4 and 2, that is, I have entered even less. I went to 0.2, as I voiced it on the stream. That is, if I take my 20, multiply by 0.2, then in general, it should just turn out to be 4. Yes, that's exactly the same 0.2% deposit, and there was definitely not 10. That is, I had to use 200 walruses. If it were 200 walruses, then my transaction amount would be like this $10,000, and my deposit would be $10,000. Well, the transaction amount of $10,000 with 200 walruses, I would sit quietly, because let's logically calculate. The position went there at about minus 300, it turns out minus 30% of the deposit would be the edge, and in the end, we took 1,000. That is, I would have X2 to the deposit, and made it so that due to the fact that I entered 10% of the deposit, that is, I would not be affected in any way, even if I entered 10%. Therefore, it is possible that when placing an order, somehow a person somewhere incorrectly counted something somewhere. In other words, it is necessary to sit down, calculate once, and use the amount. You can write the transaction amount, you can write the margin. I am here, for some reason, it has become more convenient for me to write exactly the amount on the bill. When I was trading, I always wrote to the March on the Mexc, but there I could always put a fixed 50th shoulder on the Mexc. I can't do this on WEEX, because if you click on leverage, there won't be a check mark like on the Mexc. It's gone out of the Mexc again now, yes, and I won't show it from this. But when you set the shoulder, change it here, for example, the 10th shoulder, you should have a check mark apply to all pairs here. And you click OK and that's it. That's it, you will have a maximum of 50 shoulder everywhere. Therefore, when I was trading on Mexc, I calmly wrote the margin, without worrying that I would not have a sharply 100th shoulder there. Because of this, my transaction amount would change accordingly and the REM would be violated. And here, if I come in with at least the 20th, 30th shoulder, it doesn't matter. If I go in from the 40th with a shoulder of 40, I'll put 40 right now. Yes, I have a walrus changing here, but the transaction amount is all the same 200. In fact, my RAM does not change either. There will be more mathematics here, because here is a person who threw us off, here to apply to all futures at the same time. You click and it's done. Let's go to the feed, so as not to miss the deal. After all, we have a trading stream. But in parallel I will continue to tell you now. That is, in fact, your shoulder does not affect your RM. But you need to calculate it once RM, that is, the amount of the transaction. At least you can have the first one. By the way, there was a stabbing, yes, or at point blank range. And there is a plus slope on the feeder. It's also embarrassing that there are only 9 million on VIX, that is 11. Yeah, wow. This is usually several times less on VIX. So, I'm interested in this more interesting slant. Well, this is our local inclination, which looks interesting. So now. And I'm like, how long have we been on the stock exchange? Let's see. Oh, there's an interesting level here. From the zone, it was possible to short. I look, and in general, the coin gave a profit to take. I would wait for a breakout at least. I see that the funding is minus 0.3, plus we are another one. I look, we are going. Something definitely needs to wait for something interesting. So, let's switch to the mix, because we have VIX has such a property of resetting charts. Now, guys. But a wrapper minus 0.2, 0.3 is still normal, tolerable, I would say so. We'll sort out the Degen. So then let's write your coins in a notebook now. And now then, just a second, I'll take a pen, otherwise I have the property of forgetting the coins that you write. Because there are a lot of coins. We are still trading in parallel, because of this property, I get distracted and, accordingly, I forget the coins. Can I expand the question? I asked him. That's your question, right? Yes, 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 yes. Immediately expanded, if possible, to listen. First of all, is spot somehow taken into account when trading futures or not? Because the chart on the spot is slightly different. And another question in parallel to this. When she was approaching the levels of a coin as a gene, I noticed that the turnover was somewhere on the order of 6 million. And now she jumped out of the levels, that is, there are already somewhere 16 or 17, if you look at it like that. I don't remember exactly. What does this mean? How can it turn out in the end? And if the turnover goes back and decreases, which means that then too? Well, that seems to be it. I'm going to write out the questions now. When we move on to the coin, I will disassemble them. Is that good? All right. Yeah. So let's use this coin to get to the level. Plus, I was talking here and there, when we are now on VIX, we watched this coin about the zone. Now I've found everything. I was talking about a zone that has already worked out, so now it will be possible to break through the upper border, and by the way, I incorrectly marked the zone, because it was previously stabbed several times. That's it, now the zone is marked correctly. We have such interesting levels. One of the levels is how we have the upper boundary of the zone. Now it's not magnetic, it doesn't want to. Plus there is still such a level. In general, you can go into the breakdown of the upper border, plus you will need to monitor its plus. Damn it. By the way, I would also say that this stage is interesting, but it is the level, but I won't say. Because this level is stabbed with a VIP, as you can see, right? Therefore, this level does not have many values. I would go in when breaking through this level. Somewhere in this area, I would like to average, about 0.12, well, depending on the momentum of the coin, you will need to observe. And it would be averaged somewhere here. I would probably even mark another zone at this price. The zones, by the way, are very good, beautiful, and, apparently, she works them well. It's not a fact that this zone will work out now, today. You can screen it, take a screenshot, redraw it for yourself, and when the coin continues to pump there, you immediately go to the coin. See the ready-made analysis of the coin, you understand whether it's worth going in or not. The conclusion on the coin is that you need to wait for the level to be collected, this is at least, and watch the momentum. Plus, I would also like to have the Mexc fixed for us. No, they haven't fixed it yet. Okay, then I'm also turning on the notification. So, now notifications are enabled. So the chairman saw something here, announced a cryptile table on the 4th round, because he adopted a more supportive crypt, and a regulatory structure aimed at establishing new guidelines for emission and storage. He stated that future policies will focus on developing rules and an exemption mechanism with potential provision and self-storage under certain conditional stock documents. So far, I don't see a word about the fact that I only see about storage and regulation, exemption, but I don't see the word purchase. Now, if the word prosec were to be used in such news, it would be interesting, but it's not. According to the feed, we are waiting for the level. We have 3% of the indicator, may not send pressure. So if it's not hard for someone, the guys could be tracked down. Wow, someone's looking at a splint here. We have me looking back and forth and the 100th vlog. Cool. Tough guy. I'm looking at Victor Wright on Retu Hooked, right? Okay. Now guys. Well then. Well, we are waiting for the conclusion on the file. Let's go back to REM. On some stream, I said this one moment that when my deposit, yes, for example, is $2,000, then I consider from this amount. And then, when I go up to 3,000, I don't recalculate them. That is, it is clear there, for example, now if you recalculate the REM, then the transaction amount for me can change a lot. Because with a deposit of $2,000, and 1% is 20 for us, and 0.5 is 10. If you already take to 800, then the margin is 28 1%, 14 is 0.5%. It turns out that I actually added 40% to the margin, not bad then. And if you compare the amount of another transaction, for example, just so mathematically visually distinguish how much my REM has changed now. It may change if I recalculate it, but now I'm going to explain why I don't do it. Although if you recalculate all of them there every day, then in theory, you will have a deposit growing exponentially. That is, in fact, if my margin has changed by 40%, then the transaction amount should change by 40% there. That is, if I trade with the 50th shoulder, then it was with $2,000, 500 bucks, this is 10 margin. And at the moment we will get it already, if I'm not mistaken, $700. That is, well, a decent difference in the amount of the transaction, too. Yes. But why don't I recalculate? I do this by virtue of, so to speak, money management. I earn it from a deposit of 2,000. Until they reach 3,000, I will not change my REM. Purely psychologically, it's more convenient, purely physically convenient. Someone, if you want, you can try to accelerate your deposit exponentially, that is, constantly change, recalculate the REM, constantly change the transaction amount, but for me personally, from the psychological side, it's a little hard. Due to my workload, I can get stupid at some point. And because of this, I choose a fixed amount for myself. There, these $500 is 0.5% of the deposit. As a rule, this is the maximum first entry. I personally have a different REM from you, because if you open the section where to start, then this is it. Someone. A coin. If you open the section where to start, where you must read this message, you will see that I will not visually see it now, if I see it now. I will pay no more than 0.5% of the deposit in total. So this is for you? But due to the fact that I have many times more experience, many times more knowledge. I used 2% of the deposit, that is, when trading, you also calculate yourself an understated room, a standard room, and a threshold room. That is, you always have an understated you should, as in general, personally, I have a mathematically understated room. This is the room when I can average and will be around the normal standard room. That is, my standard room is 0.51%. That is, if I say understated room, I go to 0.1%. Went to 0.1%, quietly eliminated to 0.2%. This is still not my standard room. I already have 0.2% of the transaction deposit, but at the same time, I still have an understated room. I see that the deal is not going in my direction. I calmly reach my room already to 0.4, thereby I am on the threshold of my standard REM. That is, in fact, if I went into a guaranteed, so to speak, deal from the lower limit, where I take the impulses of 0.5%. Yesterday we went into some coin like that, where I calmly 0.5% went in and out. There we had this deal at the beginning of the stream, if I'm not mistaken, and by the way, it was XPR, which we went into yesterday, and damn, to be honest, it was very late to come out. It was we who could decently pick up the movement of 20% as if, let's just say a little FOMA, a little word for myself. Well, some guys there pulled very decently, as a result they took away, of course I don't remember how many percent, but quite enough. That is, you sit down once, calculate your understated REM, taking into account so that you average there. And you had 2 or 3 averaging there and you just came to a normal REM. If you actually log in. Let me tell you my order, how I usually work with an understated REM, and you can mathematically also apply them to your own. That is, in fact, I have 0.1%, this is usually an understated REM. I average the position by 0.1%. That is, this is my first averaging. I already have 0.2% of the deposit in the transaction, that is. The next averaging I will have 0.2% of the deposit. I am averaging on these 0.2. I already have 0.4% of the deposit, and I have averaged twice already. Then the coin, to be honest, it is very rare that the third or fourth averaging is present in the coin. Often I can take a loss in such situations, because if there I see that the coin has flown one zone, the second zone has flown into the third, but it's clear that it's pointless, it's better to let go of the coin, take a loss. I usually overlap this loss quickly. So let's move on. 0.4% of the deposit, I actually approach the 0.5%, that is, 0.5%. This is my usual standard first entry to the usual REM came up. 0.4, 0.5%, roughly speaking, is an error. Because now the situation will have to be averaged again in the next position, and there the transaction amount is already, well, it is clear that it is multiplied by x2. Here, 0.4% deposits are already transactions. I will have to average 0.4% again. I already have 0.8% of the transaction deposits. That is, how much averaging have I done already? 1, 2, 3. 3 averages are calm, and I have only 0.8%. This is half of mine, from the upper limit, and the RAM. Then there was some kind of situation, of course, I've never had this before, that I averaged so many times, well, okay. Again, I need to average, it's an extreme situation in general. I accept that it is necessary to average again for the last time. Again I have 0.8 deals, so I am averaging by 0.8. Thus, I have 1 and 6% of the transaction deposit. That's it, I can't average more in any way at all, in any way. That's it. Because in order to average, it is necessary to average by 1 and 6 more, that is, by an equal amount of the transaction. And this, sorry, will be 2 and no, 3/2% of the deposit, that is. It will already exceed mine by 1/2%, well, that's a lot. Therefore, you need to sit down once, mathematically calculate all this, then calculate the transaction amount, that is, the walrus multiplied leverage, as it is convenient for anyone. You can set up how I traded on Mexc. This is a fixed 50th maximum leverage, then just trade with it. In other words, you calculated, so I essentially get averaging times 2, 3, 4. That is, I can average 4 times. That is, you take the maximum threshold, divide it by 4 so that. No, but I have to divide it by 4. It is necessary to divide much less. This should be considered, guys. I won't say it right away, because I did it once and forgot, and then after a working and school day I can't do it like that. Can I? It turns out that when you trade, you make, well, approximately an entry based on the market. You also navigate, for example, a growing market, a falling one. If it's growing, then you underestimate the frame at the moment. If it's falling, then you do it higher accordingly. In other words, what factors do you still lean towards when entering? That's it, I get it. Look, a falling, growing market. Well, I apologize for the expression. I don't care what kind of market there is. There will be at least 200 cue balls. I will still trade according to my and I underestimate my at times when there is a liquidity flow, when there is a doubtful zone. If this zone is good, some kind of global, then I can use 0.5% of the deposit there, calmly go in. And most likely I will take a profit on the first impulse. In an understated RAM, as a rule, it is used on a liquidity sweep or in questionable transactions. Where I'm like, damn, well, we've come to the level, a coin like this, for example, XPR, do you see? I don't remember, yesterday they pressed the coin very hard. By the way, we probably got a plus or minus on this impulse somewhere, but we could have taken 35% here. But we had to pull it off. So, room is always underestimated, if I understand that I am risking when I go to 0.5% here. Yesterday, I took a risk yesterday, but I don't remember what I took a risk, although here I had to average twice. I don't remember going to 0.2, 0.5, or 0.205, but most likely I went because of breaking through this level. I just had a lot of our deal yesterday, I don't remember. I'm not going to lie. That is, if a dubious transaction is in the coin, and there is some news, some information that the coin is being driven on purpose, artificially, then it is necessary to underestimate them. The liquidity needs to be underestimated again. The local zone needs to be underestimated again. If the zone is good, beautiful, well, it is clear that it has worked out more than once. It is clear that the levels are some serious and far away. I calmly go to 0.5, 1%, realizing that I have an ideal entry point in fact. And that with a huge 99% probability I will take this movement. That is, in such situations. Because, pay attention, the indicator and the strategy worked when the cue ball was 80, when the indicator was launched. The cue ball was 100 and plus. And I also traded very actively. I think those who have heard more than once for a long time how I accelerated the deposit from $100 to 1.5 to 700 and from 100 to 4,000. Now, due to my employment, due to the fact that I now have exams in front of my nose, I have at the end of May. At the end of May there are 2 exams, at the very beginning, at the beginning of June there is another exam. That is, I have 3 exams ahead of me, I am preparing for them. Accordingly, I have a job, I don't have time to trade as much as other people trade. As far as I know, Victor was trading quite actively with us at some point. He has a decent deposit, $1,000, and has repeatedly withdrawn his 1,000. If Victor is here, he can turn on the microphone and announce how many times he has withdrawn this $1,000. I know that he has deduced twice. I think he has already deduced the 3rd and 4th times. In other words, this is the person who is included in the market, who trades more than I do, and makes the results correspondingly very good. I started 2000, I don't remember when exactly on VIX, and I've already made $800 from these 2000. And to be honest, it hasn't been 2 weeks. That is, I usually trade with you on the stream. There I will open a couple of deals after the stream. That is, there are few deals. But at the same time, $800. That is, if it was almost 50% of the deposit made, well, as much as possible on light, guys. It hasn't been half a month, I think. Therefore, the understated REM, I think it is clear why. By the way, the feed still went down. Yeah, thanks. Now, if I had decided to enter the Fed here now, I would have lowered the REM, because next to the upper border. And at the upper border there is a level, like in the resistance zone, so you can go in. I could have come in, but I was afraid, although it was safe to take 7% with you here, but I was afraid and didn't go in. By the way, Victor, I'm not such a coward as I am, and took 230%. Right here. Wow, Marina, look at the result we have. In general, I did a great one. Marina burns herself a fig. 2,650%. In general, the fire is Marina. I gave it out, I showed everyone the masterclass as it should be. How should I shorten it? So let's see what the indicators are sending us.